चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। नमः ॐ विष्णुपादाय कृष्णपृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्त स्वामी इति नामिने। नमस्ते सरस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्यदेशतारिणे वाञ्छाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधार श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद। हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। Hare Krishna. Today we continue our discussion on the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and today we enter into the modern period. The modern period is what began from Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura, more or less. So here we've been discussing the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and we started with the Goswamis and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu soon after that, who was just before them, and then we discussed about Vishwanath Chakra Thakur and Baldev Vidyabhushan yesterday. Today we discuss about Bhaktivinoda Thakura. And in our last session we were discussing about Bhaktivinoda Thakur and to some extent about Srila Prabhupada. The underlying theme that is being discussed is that this world is always a place of challenge. That in this world there will always be ups and downs. And not just ups and downs at the material level for those who are materially attached. That is there, of course. There's happiness and distress. That is there. But even for those who are spiritually purposeful, those, so we could say, there's the spiritual level, there's the material level. Now, those who want to themselves go towards Krishna, they're spiritually purposeful. However, the great acharyas are not just spiritually purposeful, they are spiritually purposeful in the material world. That means it's not just that they want to go toward Krishna, they want to take the people in this world toward Krishna. They want Krishna to be manifested in this world. And thus, the ups and downs of this world affect them also. Maybe not personally, but in terms of the service that they are going to do, that affects them. And they respond to it in a transcendental way by staying fixed in their purpose. So generally, the acharyas, their characteristic is fixed in purpose, flexible in path. Path means how is that purpose to be achieved? That has to be done at different times in different ways. So in the Indian tradition itself, there was much upheaval. In every century in human history, there are people who feel, oh, this is the most difficult century. This is the most tough of times. This is like no other time in history, in the history of the world. And yet, there are times which bring far greater change and challenge than others. So when, right from the Goswamis down to Baldev Vidyabhushan, most of the challenges were internal to our tradition. Islam, although it had turned out to be a political superior, in the sense that Islam had gained a lot of political power, and there are some Islamic rulers who were always who were quite tyrannical and religiously intolerant, but it had never been an intellectual competitor. Hmm? It had much of the time it had been a political superior, but intellectual competitor hardly. And because of this, what happened is that the Brahminical elite, the intellectuals, didn't feel any need to engage with Islam. They just felt it important to engage in theological, philosophical debates with others in the tradition. And that's why within the Vedic tradition, the various acharyas have written critiques of even thought systems that were insignificant in terms of their mass following. So, for example, Buddhism, Jainism, Charvakism. Now, Buddhism was quite influential at one time between 5th century BC to 5th century AD, and so was Jainism. But after Shankaracharya unified the Vedic tradition, then after that, it was no longer a major challenge. Now, Buddhism became another challenger only post independence when the framer of our constitution, Bhimrao Ambedkar, adopted Buddhism. But then his was a political adoption of Hindu Buddhism, and it is quite different from what was traditionally considered Buddhism. But anyway, still Buddhist scholars often wrote commentaries on the Vedic texts, of course, critiquing them, and the Indic scholars responded to them. Now, Islam was never a competitor in that league. Now, no, this is not a disrespect of Islam. This is just a fact of the intellectual history of India. So the acharyas did not feel any need to write any critique of Islam. However, when European colonialism came to India, things changed dramatically. European colonialism, from Europe came two distinct schools of thought. One was Christianity, and the other was rationality. Now, rationality is the spirit of science. Now, there are some Christians who claim that rationality also came from Christianity, and that's a separate discussion in itself. But over a period of time, Christianity and rationality started diverging. And often there were conflicts at the intellectual and political level within Europe, and especially within UK, within parties which were more overtly Christian and parties which were more overtly rational. However, both of them, they share the same purpose: attack Sanatan Dharma. Their purpose was different. That Christianity wanted to evangelize, that we want all these people who are pagans. In every religious tradition, there is a derogatory name for outsiders. Muslims have kafirs, Christians have pagans, the Vedic tradition has mlechas and yavanas. So Christians wanted to evangelize, and they thought this is a big dark continent of uncivilized people. Now, the rationalists, they thought these people are so unscientific. They believe in all kinds of mythological things. In fact, one Western scholar, when he came to India, he said that humanity has always had a mythological imagination, but nowhere has that mythological imagination run as wild as in the Indian tradition. Imagine not just one or two gods, but thousands and thousands of gods. Not just imagining one heaven, but dozens of, nearly a dozen, 14 planetary systems, and beyond that, so many planets. I said, how could anyone be so irrational? And now these attacks had bite for many reasons. One of the reasons was primarily that they had technological power with them. That the British, although they were relatively much smaller in number, they, by the power of technology, often had better weapons. And sometimes those could be a game changer. If in today's world also, there's a saying that you bring a knife to a gunfight. You can't even reach the opponent shoots you. If you are fighting with an ordinary gun against somebody who has a machine gun, that's disastrous. If we are somebody's fighting with a machine gun against somebody who has got cannons, that's disastrous. And this advanced technology and the scientific spirit that it seemed to signify created a formidable intellectual challenge in, for the Indian tradition, especially for the intellectuals. So now we won't go deeply into the history of British colonialism. Our focus is on the Gaudiya Vaishnava history. But Gaudiya Vaishnavism emerged in Bengal, and Bengal was one of the first places that Britain got its foothold. And when it got its foothold, from there was the Battle of Plassey, which they won, and after that, things went moving forward and forward. And each time, when the British, despite having far lesser forces, would win against rulers with far greater forces, whether they be Hindu rulers or whether they be Muslim rulers, the legend of British brilliance grew in the human mind. That it was not just that these people were rational, it was not just these people had great technology, they seemed to have be great at strategy also. Now, of course, that strategy could be called cunning by some people and deceptiveness by others. But then the Muslims had also done something similar. But here the British were outwitting even the Muslims. So there grew in India the what was especially in Bengal, and it spread all over the world, all over the country. What grew in Bengal was called as the Bhadraloka. The Bhadraloka were an educated class of people who found their employment with the British government. And the British educated them so that these people could fit into their vision of the government. Now, when the Muslims ruled India, now even when I'm using the word Muslims, I'm neither using it in the derogatory sense nor in a overtly generalizing strengths. There's a significant difference between the Muslim rulers and the British rulers. Many of the Muslims who came to rule India found India attractive and settled in India. The British never decided to settle in India. In fact, for the British, India was such a terribly hot country, filled with so many diseases, that whoever was sent to India, whether it be to be a viceroy or the governor general or whoever, was seen to have got a punishment. It was like being exiled in India, what is called to Kala Pani. And somebody would be sent to Andaman and Nicobar. They may be sent to government service, but that government service is like a punishment. So the British had a great disdain. Disdain means looking down at India. The, the Muslims may have also had that, but it was primarily toward the religion of India, which was, according to them, idolatry, and it had to be destroyed. But they adopted India as their home. And there are very few British who actually wrote positively about India. It's only early when the colonial ambitions had not become prominent that they wrote positively. But as the colonial ambitions started taking root, then much of the writing about India was negative. And because the British never intended to settle in India, they decided that India would best be ruled by Indians who were not just politically obedient to the British, but who also had become intellectually persuaded that the British way of living is better. and would therefore do the will of the British without too much opposition. Now, of course, it is also a fact of history that the Indian independence struggle arose among the same educated class of people who the British had trained to be subordinate to them. Because when the Indian educated class studied about British history, as the Britain wanted them to do, then they learned there about democracy, they learned there about the non dictatorial forms of government, and they saw how what Britain considered to be ideals over there and what they were implementing in India were so different, and they protested initially through words, then through agitations, and then through very aggressive action. So, while all this political turbulence was slowly gaining steam, the spiritual tradition of India faced an unprecedented challenge. The challenge was previously, intellectually, each side had to prove that their philosophy was the conclusion of the Vedic literature. Of course, Buddhists, Jains didn't accept the Vedic literature, but they were not very significant. So whether it was Shankaracharya or Ramanacharya or Madhvacharya or even the Gaudiya Sampradaya, the primary challenge was that the Vedas were accepted as authority, but what do the Vedas mean? So by writing commentaries on the Vedic literature, the particular teachers and acharyas of each tradition would try to establish the authenticity of that tradition. But with the British rule coming into India and catching the intellect of majority of the Indians or majority of the influential Indians who were well educated, now the question became not what do the Vedas mean, but do the Vedas even matter? That they say so many things, and what among it is even relevant today? And unfortunately, here, this was a question which the Brahminical elite of India were not equipped to face. So the driving question, now we can't understand from today's perspective how consequential, catastrophically consequential. The pre-British times, the question was, what do the Vedas mean? What is the actual meaning of the Vedas? What do the Upanishadic texts mean? Which philosophy is most faithful to the Vedas? But in the British times, the question became, do the Vedas even matter? So the idea became that what is the rational meaning of life? That if you want to have a meaningful life, if you want to have a purposeful life, then how can that be understood rationally? Are the Vedas rational? So this was an enormous tension. And many of the Brahmanas who had often excelled in Sanskrit were utterly uninterested and unequipped to face this intellectual challenge. The Brahmanas just neglected it as a political change. Now, again, when I use the word Brahmanas, I'm generalizing, but just as the Brahmanas had neglected the intellectual challenge of Islam, they neglected the intellectual challenge of Christianity and rationality. But this was a different animal. This was a far more deadly beast. And it started making inroads into the Indian mind, especially the Indian intelligentsia, whatever they were. Now, so these two schools of thought, rationality and Christianity, both were critiquing Sanatan Dharma. And those who were supposed to be the protectors of Sanatan Dharma mostly spoke and taught in Sanskrit, and they spoke and taught in the local languages when it was the oral tradition going on. But neither of these were equipped to counter the challenges that were written in books in English. And initially, the Brahmins were so elitist that they refused to even teach British who wanted to learn Sanskrit. But somehow a few British learned, and then the British wrote books critiquing the Vedic literature in English. Now, Max Muller wrote a book on his, edited a series of books called the Sacred Texts of the East, something like that. And initially, he starts out being quite appreciative. Oh, the creative depths are so great. But then he says the creative insights, they come like flashes of lightning. But at the end, you have what is an ocean of darkness and confusion. And his aim was that he wanted to intellectually destabilize and destroy the very foundations of Sanatana Dharma so that the light of Christian wisdom would illumine the heart of the savage and uncivilized Indians. I'm just paraphrasing his words over here. Now, it was in this environment that Bhaktivinoda Thakur grew up. And understanding the context is so important to understand what Bhaktivinoda Thakur actually did. So, when Bhaktivinoda Thakur was active, he, right from his childhood, was quite intellectually precocious. He had a difficult life because he was constantly quite sick, facing varieties of ailments. And he grew up in a time of great intellectual ferment, and he got educated in the British educational system. And he, after facing various challenges, rose to a very influential position as a magistrate, as a judge. Now, this was not a position that the British gave very easily to Indians, because what it meant was that a brown man could now be in a position to judge a white man. And they absolutely considered the brown man has no moral or intellectual capacity to judge us. But the fact that Bhaktivinoda Thakur rose to that level showed his brilliance. Now, if we consider his religious and spiritual evolution, that is also an interesting trajectory. Now, of course, from a transcendental perspective, we can say that he is an eternal associate of the Lord, and he just manifested his eternal spiritual nature at a particular time. Yes, that is true, and that is one way of looking at things. But if you're looking at it from that way, then there is very little to learn about how Bhaktivinoda Thakur understood his times and how he responded to those times. So, if we want to learn about how to practice and present the timeless path of divine love, Krishna Bhakti, to our times, then it is important for us to recognize what actually was happening in those times. So, what did Bhaktivinoda Thakur do? He grew up in a Shakta family, and his grandfather was apparently quite a spiritually evolved person, and he predicted this is the time I'm going to die. And he prepared his death and he departed. He was a worshipper of the goddess. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur said in childhood, sometimes he would feel fear. And he was told, chant the names of Ram. And he found that chanting the names of Ram gave him such sense of fearlessness that that's what he took up eventually. And so he grew up in a religiously eclectic background. And he grew up at a time when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was still known in the Bengali mind, although it had been several centuries that had passed, yet the effect of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was still significant. Now, when British people came to Bengal, they said that in many, many homes in India, they found Gaura or Gaura Nitai or Gaura Gadadhar were being worshipped. So they were almost like folk deities of Bengal. Now, when he grew up, he went through various intellectual phases. He explored Unitarian Christianity. Christianity has two broad aspects to it. There is Trinitarian Christianity, which is Catholicism. They accept the Son, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. Unitarian Christianity is more universal, and they try to be like one church for the whole world. And then he read many of the Western philosophers, and that time he was a part of the literati, of the literary people in those times. He moved around among those. He wrote English poetry, and he wrote English poetry not just replicating the themes that were taught in the schools, which were primarily Western themes, but he also wrote a poem about the great King Puru, who stood up firm against Alexander, and he grew up in a very intellectually broad way. And then, as he was growing, he was at a time when many of these Indian intellectuals who had studied the British way. Now, the British focus was, or purpose in giving Indians the Indian education system, according to the British way, was that Indians would reject their own tradition and become British. But that didn't happen. Many Indians used the values that they learned from the British education system to critique the British themselves. And they also used those values to critique their own tradition. And many of them tried to see what was of value that they could find in this tradition. And they all came up with different ideas. There was the Brahmo Samaj, which came, and then there was the Arya Samaj, and then there were many other organizations that were coming, which were trying to find some sense within the Vedic tradition and try to bring a rational presentation of the Vedic tradition that would be commensurate, that would be acceptable and appealing to the contemporary mind. When Bhaktivinoda Thakura tried to reconcile these two parts of him, the experiential part of him said that there was something of sublime value in the tradition that he had grown up in. And the rational part of him said that, yeah, this approach of looking at things that he had got from the West was also significant. And then he started looking at the Vedic tradition from that perspective. The Bhagavad was very popular in Bengal at that time. And when he started reading it, an essay on the Bhagavatam, that is the first book that was like Bhaktivinoda Thakur's coming out book. Nowadays, the word coming out refers to somebody who has some private practices or beliefs which they don't generally tell the world, which they keep hidden. And at a particular point of time, they decide to bring it out. So he tried to give in that essay, which was actually later published in the book, and which was actually a talk given by him to the Bengali friends, and a few British had also come over there. He tried to explain the value of the Bhagavatam to them. And he starts in a very empathic tone. He says, I grew up like you, thinking that these Puranas were just stories with nothing of value in them. But he talks about his journey and how his thoughts changed. So for him, it was that he was still attracted to the personality of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, such an exemplary renunciate, and he appreciated the value of renunciation as well as morality that Mahaprabhu had demonstrated. And then he said, why is Mahaprabhu worshipping a person like Krishna, who is so immoral? In fact, when the British came to India, they targeted the religious systems of India. And among them, there were two primary targets. One was Kali and the other was Krishna. They said, how can any thoughtful, civilized person worship a deity who is so brutal, who wears a garland of skeletons around her head, around her neck. And how can any thoughtful, civilized person worship a deity who is so utterly immoral, who dances with other men's wives? And so Kali and Krishna were the two major targets of the British. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur had read this literature. And then he prayed, "Oh Mahaprabhu, please help me understand this mystery." And that was the time when, after great effort, he discovered the Chaitanya Charitamrita. It's significant that he had to put in great efforts and years of searching to find even one copy of Chaitanya Charitamrita. We had discussed earlier about how Chaitanya Charitamrita had actually saved the Gaudiya tradition by making a bridge built between the scholars in Vrindavan and the followers in Bengal. However, because the Chaitanya Charitamrita was so philosophical, because it spent so much time in building the philosophy, it was not a book that people who just wanted to hear Gaur Katha were likely to cherish. So Chaitanya Bhagavat and Chaitanya Mangal were relatively easily available. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur was told by some of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas at that time, although he didn't think of himself as a Gaudiya Vaishnava, they told him that if you want to understand Mahaprabhu and his teachings and his personality and his object of worship, you need to read the Chaitanya Charitamrita. And then that's what he was searching for. And finally, when he found the Chaitanya Charitamrita and he read the Chaitanya Charitamrita, that brought about a dramatic transformation in him. And from that time onwards, he became not just a follower of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but a prominent teacher of the glories of the teachings of Mahaprabhu. And what Bhaktivinoda Thakur did thereafter was remarkable. Now, if we look at it from a historical perspective, for much of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was an outsider. Now we consider him to Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharya, but at that time, he was an outsider. Had been born in the Shakta family. He was educated in the British educational system. He worked for the British government. And given how Shakta worship was prevalent at that time in Bengal, it was at some tension with Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And most of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas at that time were more priests. They would chant Gaur Nitai, teach people to chant Gaur Nitai, and do some rituals for people. But they were not really that great scholars. Again, not all of them, but many of them. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur was an outsider. So now they were not doing the job of teaching Gaudiya Vaishnavism in a way that could be appealing or even relevant to the mainstream mind of that time, to the intelligent, educated, English-speaking people of those times. So now Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to, by his own study, learn the tradition and then teach it. Now he took initiation from Vipin Bihari Goswami, who was a prominent Mahanta, priest. The word Mahanta has many different meanings, but one of the meanings is that one who is like an official head of a matha or of a group. So Vipin Bihari Goswami was the formal initiating guru. And that's how Bhaktivinoda Thakur gained a foothold within Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Now, he was inspired much more by Jagannath Baji, whom he found an immensely saintly person, completely absorbed in love for Krishna and love for Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But either way, through both of these, he slowly got connected and then with the Gaudiya tradition, and then he started becoming a spokesperson for the Gaudiya tradition. Now, he was speaking to an audience of people who were very much rational and to some extent critical of the Vedic tradition. And having heard the criticism of Krishna Bhakti as immorality, as an expression of immorality, or at least as a license for immorality, they were not at all receptive to the learning about Krishna. Now, this immorality also had Sahajiaism associated with it. And I will talk about the challenge of Sahajiaism in the session tomorrow when we talk about Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur's life. But today, let's focus on the challenge of rationality. So, now, in order to present Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Bhaktivinoda Thakur also had to establish it what Gaudiya Vaishnavism was not. And thus, he established a list of which are the bona fide followers and which are the upper sampradayas. And he did a lot of writing. Now, Bhaktivinoda Thakur's writing was his main contribution. He was not a organization builder in the normal sense of the word. He did actually come up with the idea of an organization, and much of the Bhakti Vriksha that is present in many parts of our movement as its seeds in what Bhaktivinoda Thakur taught, or conceived rather. But now his books, in general, his writings, we could say, they were his main service. And through his writings, he was reaching out to many different people. At one level, he was reaching out to the rational people. That rational approach was there. He was also reaching out to the masses. Now, for the masses, what was he doing? He was writing songs. So the music as a means for spiritual cultivation has been a major part of all the theistic traditions of the world. And this was especially prominent in the Bhakti tradition because it's a path of love, and music and singing is a natural way of expressing love. But unfortunately, the masses were singing devotional songs, but often those devotional songs did not have the proper philosophical understanding. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur took the same meter, same tone, same style, and composed profound devotional songs. Now, today, when we hear Bhaktivinoda Thakur songs, those are the only songs that we hear. But if we consider the other similar songs that were there during his times, those other songs were often songs which were completely mundane, with something about Krishna, but a lot of mundane emotion mixed with it. So what he did was an artistic genius. It's like nowadays some devotees may take some popular Bollywood tunes and then have Hare Krishna Kirtan in those tunes. Now, of course, for those who are familiar with Hare Krishna, they may be reminded of the Bollywood song by those tunes. But those who have no knowledge about Hare Krishna, when they hear those Bollywood tunes, then for them the Bollywood tunes are familiar. Hey, what are you singing with this tune? That's what new. So, or nowadays some devotees use a mantra rock and these kind of things. Now, for those whom rock is new and rock is what is exciting, when they hear Hare Krishna in the rock, what will happen is they will remember the rock and forget the Hare Krishna. But for those whom rock is cool and they're familiar with it, then that's comforting music. With that, Hare Krishna is given. So, what we consider as tradition, those songs and the style of those songs at one time was a deviation. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur's expertise was that the style that was a deviation, he made it into the style of the tradition. So, of course, I'm simplifying much of the history over here, but this was his outreach to the masses. Now, as far as the rationality was concerned, he focused on many things. One was his philosophical writings or theological writings, and the other was the first time he did in our tradition was writing novels. So, He wrote books like Chaitanya Shikshamrita and Jaiva Dharma. Chaitanya Shikshamrita is a very systematic book of theology. Now, Jaiva Dharma and then Prema Pradipa, these are books which are written in the form of novel. The idea of novel as a literary genre was something novel. In the past, there would be plays, and we discussed how Natya, how dramas had been a major part of our tradition. And they were a part of the religious traditions of most of the religions across the world. But novels were something different. Plays are what are written primarily for being enacted. Novels are not enacted at all. That's why a novel has to be made into a movie. Then there has to be a script written. And there's a lot more that goes into a script than just telling a story. How the story is to be depicted also. All that is given over there. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur is the first person in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition who wrote a novel. So what was he doing? You remember we discussed how there's a tradition and there's a contemporary audience. And realization, Prabhupada says, means to present the wisdom of the tradition in a way that is interesting for the audience of the times. So what he did was that the format of the novel was becoming very interesting, and it was new and intriguing for people during those times. And he took the wisdom of the tradition and presented it in the form of a novel. Now, apart from that, so this was systematic works of theology, like the Chaitanya Shikshamrita. Then he also wrote novels. Now, another thing that he tried to do. Now, these books were more systematic but presented in an innovative format. But one of the biggest critiques of the tradition was its seeming irrationality. The irrationality was with respect to the idea of two things. The cosmology was crazy and the mythology was crazy. That all these creatures and all these, like in Krishna Lila, there are all these demons. And how can any thoughtful person believe in all these demons? And this whole cosmology, all these time spans and dimensions in terms of size and idea of a serpent on whose hoods the universe is standing, or a serpent at the bottom of the ocean, these seem utterly irrational to the rationally educated mind. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to address all this. So one of his much misunderstood works was the Krishna Samhita. Now, there were many challenges that Bhaktivinoda Thakur faced, and he came up with very, very creative ways of presenting the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition and the broad Vedic tradition also in ways that could be intelligible to people. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur played multiple roles. At one place, when Dayanand Saraswati, who's founded the Arya Samaj, wrote critiquing the worship of deities. So, like I said, this project of trying to find out what is of value in the Vedas and present it to the modern mind. Different people try to do it differently. So, Arya Samaj, what they did was they said only the original Vedas are pure. And everything after that, the Puranas, Itihasas, are all deviant and all of them should be rejected. And they said the whole idea of deity worship comes in this later literature. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur even defended the worship of Kali when the Arya Samaj is criticized it. So one more thing that Bhaktivinoda Thakur did was that he wrote a magazine, Sajjan Toshini and others. And it was through that magazine that he was cultivating a regular intellectual following. He was writing books, but books take a lot of time and effort to write. And they are published gradually, read gradually, but magazines go on a steady basis. So he would write magazines and people would read and they would write letters and would respond to them. And what he was doing through this was he was having a very uh, live community of people being cultivated. So nowadays with social media, people may cultivate a community. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was doing like that at that time. Now, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, as I said, because he was a grahastha, because he had a job, and because he was primarily an intellectual who focused on writing and presenting things intellectually, he was not himself directly a, a community builder in the sense of he personally cultivating people and encouraging them in their spiritual lives and counseling them. That was not what he was doing. But he was laying the intellectual foundation, which was useful at his times and subsequent times also. So now in Chaitanya Shikshamrita to some extent and Krishna Samhita, he addressed these two questions, those of the irrational seeming of the cosmology and the mythology seeming to be just a wild imagination. So this is where he followed the tradition and he brought in the idea of explaining things in non-literal terms. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur took these three terms, the words Kanishtha, Madhyama, and Uttama. So now these are terms which are very generic terms within Sanskrit. Kanishta means introductory, Madhyama means at the intermediate level, and Uttama is the best. Now, in the Goswami's literature, these terms were used in particular ways. That Kanishta meant a devotee at a particular level, Madhyama meant a devotee at a particular level, Uttama meant a devotee at a particular level. And he did not take that particular framework. He explained that Kanishta are the literalists, those who take scripture literally, that everything that is described in scripture, this is how it exactly happened, and there is nothing more to discuss about. Hmm. And those who were intelligent, rational, thoughtful people, they said, these are all stories, who will take it seriously? So you have to, if at all there is of some value in these stories, we have to look at the symbolic meanings of the stories. So he said the Madhyamas, they look for non-literal meaning in the stories. And he acknowledged that those who look for non-literal meaning are actually more intelligent, that they are more thoughtful. And thus, Bhaktivinoda Thakur gave non-literal meaning to the various demons in the Krishna Lila. So, for example, Putana represents a false guru, Dhenukasura represents this, and the Shaktasura represents that. Now, if we look at what Bhaktivinoda Thakur has done in the chapter of Chaitanya Shikshamrita, he actually doesn't give any elaboration. Why does Putana represent false guru? Why does Shaktasura represent so and so? Why does this demon represent so and so? He just gives like a one sentence description and he moves on. His idea was not so much to to focus on the non-literal meaning. His idea was to get people to open their minds to see that there is some more wisdom over here. Yeah, you can look at it from non-literal perspective. But he said there are literalists, there are those who look for non-literal meaning, but beyond that, he said, are the transcendentalists. And these are the Uttama, the Rasika Bhaktas. And for them, Krishna is a spiritual reality. And they are absorbed in complete devotion to Krishna. And they are experiencing another level of reality. And he said, this is what the Bhagavatam is actually offering. This is what the ultimate purpose of bhakti is. To actually develop that consciousness by which one can become immersed in loving absorption in the ultimate reality. So in this way, he patted the non-literal meaning seekers on their back. Yeah, you are more intelligent. You are more intelligent than literalists. But don't think all devotees are literalists. Yes, there are transcendentalists. They are not taking these stories literalistically at the material level. They are completely absorbed in the spiritual level. And that is the level we need to aspire. So now sometimes the Kanishta and Uttama can appear to be very similar. And when that happens, then those who are seeking non-literal meaning can become very disrespectful and dismissive of even the transcendentalists. So literalists say that everything that is described in Krishna Lila is just exactly what happened at the material level. But the transcendentalists understand that Krishna is a spiritual reality. And that's absorption in the spiritual reality is what is most important. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the difference between literalists and transcendentalists at this point, but the key point that I'm making over here is that Bhaktivinoda Thakur accommodated the intellectuals and their need for going beyond what seemed to them to be super simplistic meanings. And similarly, when he talked about the Bhagavatam, for people who had a lot of difficulty in accepting the sheer time scales of the Bhagavatam, the sheer geographical and cosmological distances of the Bhagavatam, he said that within the Bhagavatam, there is information that is vyavaharik, that is about the material world. And the most important part of the Bhagavatam is the Paramarth. And now he uses different terms. And again, more important, the specifics of what he says is the purpose of what he's trying to achieve. He is not forcing people to have to give up science to come to bhakti. Okay, by the rational approach, yeah, you can now look at some things and some things make sense, some things may not make sense. But that's not what is the most important thing. The most important thing is that one needs to experience Krishna. And the spiritual knowledge that is there in the Bhagavatam is what is of prime importance. That is what we should be seeking. That is what we should be savoring. And once that was understood, so many people started becoming more and more open to the traditions, to the Bhagavatam. And it was that legacy that was carried on thereafter by Bhaktivedanta Thakur, eventually Vaishnava Prabhupada, and that is what we are carrying on now. So this approach of trying to understand and explain scripture rationally in a way that the modern mind can understand and accept it, not giving up or compromising on the import of scripture, but on explaining it in an appropriate way. That was the expertise of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. In many ways, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was not a very confrontational person. He was an intellectual and he gave intellectual presentations of spiritual wisdom. Now, of course, among the biggest contributions of Bhaktivinoda Thakur was actually not just the books that he wrote, not just the songs that he wrote, but also the rediscovery of the appearance place of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Now, Mahaprabhu had become a person or a deity of great influence within Bengal. And thus, there were many people who would claim XYZ, oh, this is the place where Mahaprabhu did this is the place where Mahaprabhu did this. And what place could have more prestige in the minds of the followers of Mahaprabhu than the place where he was born? So there was a place which is claimed to be the place of the appearance of Mahaprabhu. And what Bhaktivinoda Thakur observed was that things didn't seem to add up. Not only were the people who were taking care of that particular place not really very devoted to Mahaprabhu, not only were they not reflecting the character of Mahaprabhu, but also from whatever descriptions he had, he could find from archaeology, he could find from the scriptures, these things didn't seem to add up. And then he took up this challenge of trying to find out what is the actual place of Mahaprabhu. Now, this idea of claiming some special connection with someone who is of great importance and thereby claiming speciality for oneself is very common across the world. When Satsarup Maharaj was trying to write the first volume of Lila Amrit, where he was describing Prabhupada's time in India. He said that there were almost like 75 postmen who came and told that I was a postman who told Swamiji that, you should not write. And magazines, people will throw away, you write books. So now somebody who has to write history has also to become like a detective. And Satsuma decided he will not attribute to any postman because it's almost impossible to find out who that postman was. Prabhupada had already departed, and there was nobody else at that time who had seen any postman speak this to Prabhupada. So the point I'm making is this was a historical challenge, and it was not just a this was a like an intellectual detective challenge, but the stakes were high because for those people who were claiming that a particular place was the appearance place of Mahaprabhu, for them it was not a matter of prestige; it's also a matter of money. That people would come and give donations over there, and when people's monetary interests are challenged, they can become fiery. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, while he might not have been confrontational in the same sense in which, say, Prabhupada was in terms of calling out to people using strong words to condemn people, he was still a warrior and he was ready to fight. Now, the Sahaja challenges that he faced, we will mention them briefly when we talk about Sahajaism as a primary challenge at the time of Bhaktisiddhanta Swami Thakur. But at this point, what he did was he did extensive research and then he found out where the Yoga Peeth was. And while we now talk about the incident when we saw across the Jalangi River a place which seemed to be lit at night, hey, maybe that is the place of Mahaprabhu appearance. That vision, we consider it extraordinarily authoritative. But it was not that everybody would accept that vision. Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to do the hard work of providing sound evidence and reasoning. And then eventually, when Jagannath Babaji came and he was completely emaciated, he couldn't even get up and he had a basket in which he was carried around. And when he was brought to the place which Bhaktivinoda Thakur had ascertained was the place of the appearance of Mahaprabhu, he started jumping up in ecstasy. And that persuaded many people. And that's how Yoga Peeth was discovered. Of course, there is a parallel tradition where even now in Mayapur, there are people who claim that some other place is the Yoga Peeth. And there are people who still believe that. But this was one of the biggest contributions of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And then he wanted to build a magnificent temple over there. And his idea was that let us have a temple which reflects not just the glory of Mahaprabhu's divine identity, but also the glory of Mahaprabhu's mood. Mahaprabhu had told Nityanand Prabhu, go house to house, knock on people's doors, and ask them to chant the holy names. The Bhaktivinoda Thakur, despite being a highly respected magistrate, started going to people's houses, door to door, and asking them for some small contribution to build this temple for Mahaprabhu. Then eventually he retired and he focused, he was all this time working in the British government. And he focused on using the position that he had from the British government in spreading Krishna consciousness, in by bringing respectability to Krishna consciousness, and also sharing using the respect that he had from that position to actually bring to influence people. When he was in the Jagannath Puri area, he actually did a lot of work to improve the administration of Jagannath Puri temple. When he was in Vrindavan, he actually acted to, in official position, he had gone there. He tried to remove the dacoits from that area who were terrorizing priests, pilgrims who were coming there. So the principle of Yukta Vairagya he used in many ways to assist in carrying forward the mission of Mahaprabhu. Now, eventually, of course, he retired and then he immersed himself in chanting the holy names and in becoming completely absorbed in the Lord. And he it was who felt that I need a ray of Vishnu to carry on this mission. I have done my part. So much more needs to be done. And that's how Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur eventually appeared. And his story is what we will discuss in our next session. But what Bhaktivinoda Thakur achieved is, in many ways, remarkable. Among all the things that he did, he's laying the foundation for modern day Gaudiya Vaishnavism is the most enduring contribution. So when we look at Bhaktivinoda Thakur's contribution, we discussed broadly three things today. His legacy. First, I focused on the context, the time of intellectual ferment, where Islam had never been a intellectual competitor even. The Western way of living, both Christianity and rationality, they were seen as not only the intellect, at least by many, they were seen as intellectual threats. And the traditional Brahminical orthodoxy was not prepared because they spoke in Sanskrit or in the local languages, not in English. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to study himself and discover and recover the tradition in many ways. And we discussed among the challenges that he faced was the challenge. He reached out to the classes through his books on theology, like Chaitanya Shikshamrita, his books, novels like Jaiva Dharma and Prema Pradipa, and then his books for people presenting people with rationality like Krishna Samhita, especially the rational approach. And then he reached out to the masses through his songs. And then beyond that, at a cultural level, so this was his intellectual contribution. And beyond that, at a cultural level, what he did was that he recovered the Yoga Peetha, the place of appearance of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And then his legacy was continued on by his illustrious son, Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur. Thank you very much. Hare. Are there any questions or comments? So where was CC hidden? Well, it was not exactly hidden. It was not a book that was widely available. It is that some people may have had it in their library and they never read it, and they had some respect for it as a book that is old and it was kept. So now, how did he know that it have answers? Well, he was told that there were Gaudiya Vaishnava scholars, and some of them said that this is a book which you should read. So it's just like, say, if somebody is very scientifically minded, then we may tell them, okay, read the Origins magazine or read XYZ book, read this devotee author's book. So now the devotee who are telling us this may themselves not be very scientific also. They may not exactly know what the book contains, but if they tell us that, okay, you should read this book, this will provide answers to your questions. Okay, so oh yeah, let me find out, let me read this book. So it was like that. As a magistrate, how could he go house to house? Well, to some extent, he went. He did. He retired and he focused on cultivation on the project, the building of the temple. But on rather, he focused on directly spreading Krishna consciousness. But as a magistrate, it was not that that was the job was. mm, his job was not a job which kept him busy 24 hours a day. Life was relatively much more regulated at those times, and he was a very regulated person, so he made time because it was important for him. I'm not sure what is the question over here. What has being a magistrate, got to do with his going on street to street? No, this was his personal life, and he chose to live the way he wanted to. And does big material position help in spreading bhakti? It depends. That if somebody has the caliber to not only achieve that big material position and to mm, take on the responsibility of that material position without becoming overwhelmed, mm, then that is okay. For some people, achieving a big material position itself becomes so consuming that they have no time or energy or capacity left for doing anything else. So one has to pursue according to one's adhikar. What is one's capacity? What is one's ability? Based on that, one decides. Now, what are the ways for reaching out to the masses? Well, it depends. Prabhupada had Harinam Singh Kirtan on the street. Prabhupada also wanted skits and dramas to happen. And now we have devotees on social media trying to do various things. There's no one thing. The world itself is a big place, and different devotees using their creativity will come up with different opportunities. Mm. So it depends what doors will open and what will have what how much impact. There's uh, one one George Harrison did extraordinary things for Prabhupada, and who knows if in future somebody like that will be there. So broadly speaking, it's like outreach can happen in two distinct ways. One is that it's top down, the other is bottom up. So top down is basically we reach somebody who is like a Sreshta leader, and that person influences the masses. Or the other is bottom up, that we influence so many people in the masses that the classes start taking us seriously. So if we become very influential in a particular part of the world or a particular part of the country, then the politicians start taking us seriously over there. Then the other leaders start taking us seriously. So how outreach will happen, whether it will happen through the classes or the masses, we can't really say. Different devotees will feel inspired to serve in different ways, and time will tell which of these efforts is successful. Okay. Yes, there are some questions. Is there some organization who can mm, now? When was the point he shifted from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu from Shakta to Gaur Chaitanya Mahaprabhu? Well, he was never a Shakta in the sense of being a conscientious worshipper of the goddess. It was not that he was regularly chanting the mantras of the goddess. It was he was born in that family. So the point I was making about mentioning his Shakta background was that he was not an insider by birth in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, and he had to enter into the Gaudiya tradition and become a spokesperson for that. That was a significant challenge. So, what is the connection between Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Vipin Bihari Goswami, Jagannath Babaji? Well, as I said, our parampara is the Shiksha parampara, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur writes in he wrote his own autobiography as a long letter to one of his sons, uh, Lalit, Lalitnath. That so there he mentions about how after initiation by Bipin Bihari Goswami, he was transformed significantly. So he did respect Bipin Bihari Goswami mm, as a spiritual teacher. At the same time, Bipin Bihari Goswami was a part of the Jati Goswamis to some extent, no disrespect to him, but and he was on the side of the in the famous Brahman versus Vaishnava debate that later took place. He was on the side of the Brahmanas, basically. Although he was a Gaudiya Vaishnava, he said that to be a true teacher of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, one has to be born in a Brahminical family. Bhaktivinoda Thakur did not support that. At the same time, Bhaktivinoda Thakur didn't want to oppose his guru directly. That's why, and he was also sick. So then Bhaktisan Thakur represented him in that particular debate. And there was a significant confrontation in which Bhaktivinoda Thakur was widely seen to have emerged as the better. So when Bhaktivinoda Thakur wanted to break free completely Gaudiya Vaishnavism from the stronghold of the Jati Goswamis, Bhaktivinoda Thakur emphasized the Shiksha line entirely. And that's why in the Parampara line that we have, the inspirational guru of Bhaktivinoda Thakur is seen to be Jagannath Babaji. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur never rejected him, but he got his primary inspiration from Jagannath Babaji. So the parampara continued through Bhaktivinoda Thakur through Jagannath Gaur Kishore Babaji to Bhaktivedanta Thakur. So yes, Prabhu.
Bhagavatam is taken literally as Kanishta spiritual level and Madhyama as analytical level, and the transcendental they take as a Leela level. So if somebody cannot comprehend in the analytical way, if they accepting as it is and if they continue everything, will they able to achieve the highest without understanding intellectually? Is a chance of fall down. I don't think they can do.
So now when Bhaktivinoda Thakur presented the hierarchy of Kanishta, Madhyama and Uttama, so is it that if somebody is not intellectual enough to look at non-rational, the non-literal meanings of scripture, then is it that that person will not understand or not grow? If some now see the non-literal meaning, Bhaktivinoda Thakur in that particular hierarchy explained it to be higher than the literal. But then I also mentioned that the literal and the transcendental, they can seem very similar. So does everybody have to look at non-literal meanings? Not necessarily. The important thing is that when we are looking at scripture literally, we should not reduce Krishna to the material. That now we say don't reduce Krishna to simply the metaphorical, and that is true. But when we are taking literally, what does that mean? That means, say, if I am talking with you, now you have a material body and I have a material body. So when Krishna came here, when Mahaprabhu came here, did they have a material body? No. So literally, when somebody is literalist, they may not have a clear understanding of the difference between matter and spirit. So if one has a proper understanding of matter and spirit, and they're guided by those who are properly devoted, then there's no problem in them rising upwards from the without necessarily taking the detour of the non-literals, as long as they are philosophically grounded. So if that is a need, then that is accommodated. It is not that non-literal meaning is an essential step forward in one's spiritual growth. If that is a need, then it can be accommodated. That is the point which Bhaktivinoda Thakur is making. Now, as far as Chaitanya Charitamrita being found in a house in Odisha, that's possible. Now, as far as authority is concerned, the book was mentioned in the tradition as a very important book, and many people knew about the book. To know the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition means to study that book. Like I mentioned, the book's importance was known widely. So it was just that the book was not widely available or not widely read. Like if you consider Ramayana, the Ramcharitmanas is much more widely read than the Valmiki Ramayana, at least in North India. So, but that does not mean Valmiki Ramayana is unknown or not respected. So Chaitanya Charitamrita is a very important book. It was widely respected, but it's not widely read. That's why it was not widely replicated, and that's why it was not widely available. I don't think anybody has any Gaudiya scholar seriously questions the authenticity of the Chaitanya Charitamrita itself. So now, what attracted him? So, what attracted him to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu specifically? Well, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's character, he grew up hearing about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And when he met people who didn't seem to be just sentimental followers of Mahaprabhu, but also seemed to be scholars, that drew him. Those were not many, but eventually when he met them, that was a big transformative effect. And when they told him that there is A whole book which is a philosophical presentation of Mahaprabhu's teachings. That's what further attracted him. See, we may all respect some figures without really seeing them as the models for our life. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was always a respected figure in the cultural iconography of Bengal. But from there to become the model of his life, that was a different thing. Now, were Catholics and Protestants both attacking Sanatana Dharma? Well, Catholics were not much in India at that time because British were colonizing India, and Britain was primarily a Protestant country. And the Catholics, Portuguese were there in Goa, and they did their Inquisition, which was horrible. Uh, that's something which Catholic Church has never apologized for. They apologized for the Inquisition and various other places. But the so the Catholics were not really widely prevalent in India. It was mainly the Protestants. And among the scientists, well, no, as I said, none of the top scientists of those times really bothered to travel to India. India for them was like uncivilized, dirty, disease-ridden, messy, sweaty place. So those who were busy in scientific work, they didn't come to India. So it was scientifically minded people in general, those who had taken the rational approach. They were criticizing, and now as far as the Protestants were concerned, it was interesting that initially, when the British came to India, they came purely for mercenary, for financial purposes, and they saw that Indian religion was very very close to Indians, and the British were shrewd in some ways. They saw that one reason for the fall of Muslim rulers was that the Muslims antagonized the religious culture, religious temples and religious structures of India. So the British initially had a policy that they would of religious non-interference. Let these Hindus do whatever they want, and we will focus on our commercial interests only. In fact, for several years, at least initial years, the British actually banned Christian missionaries from coming to India. So no Christian missionary was allowed to legally be in India. So they would come from outside India near Bengal. There's a place outside what is called India, Serampur. So from there, they would penetrate into India. They would do their missionary work and go back and hide. And if they were caught, they would be arrested. So there are also times when the British had their British guards in their royal red dress. When Jagannath Rath Yatra would go, they would have them giving the royal escort and shooting the guns and respecting. But then a lot of things changed with the political changes in Britain, and especially so when the British East India Company was there ruling India, they tried to focus only on commercial interests. But especially after the 1857 battle, the what we call as the first independence struggle, or the battle, the mutiny, the rebellion, whatever the word we use. So then Britain somehow managed to maintain its hold on India, and that time it was decided by Britain that the East India Company cannot take care of India, so it has to come under the British crown. And so India was basically not ruled by a British government till then; it was ruled by a British company. So when the British government took it up, and after that, the Protestants gained power in the British Parliament, British House of Commons, whatever you want to call it. But then they started doing quite aggressive evangelization. So it's a complex history, but so there was conflict between the rationalists. So there are the rational interests, there are the religious interests, there are the commercial interests, and all of them had their own internal challenges also. So in tomorrow's session, we will continue and discuss about the challenges that Bhaktivinoda Thakura faced, and we'll talk about impersonalism, how it arose as a force, and why Bhaktivinoda Thakura was so strong and Prabhupada is so strong as impersonalist when Bhaktivinoda Thakura was not at all strong against it. We'll also look at the independence struggle and how our tradition has interacted with the independence struggle. And then we'll also talk about Sahajiyaism. Thank you very much. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Jai Gaur Premanande.
You are talking.